Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and we're going to be talking about the Anti-Federalists today. And we're starting with someone who's actually relatively interesting and somewhat unknown to the general public regarding the Anti-Federalists. I mean, the Anti-Federalist argument isn't well known to begin with. It's mostly because it's just not taught in history books. And honestly, most people focus so heavily on Hamilton, they think Hamilton is a genius. But we're not going to talk about how the only person who hates Alexander Hamilton more than myself is Aaron Burr. But we're going to talk about the Anti-Federalists today. And the person on screen is Luther Martin, who is a rather interesting character. He actually later joins the Federalist Party in the mid 1800s because he's not a fan of Jefferson. He does not like Jefferson, honestly. But why did the Anti-Federalist exist, and what was their big objection to the ratification of the Constitution of the United States? Well, there's 5 core reasons, though there was also a litany of other reasons for each individual Anti-Federalist. And we'll talk about some of the notable ones. First off, they believed the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights because in their eyes, the federal government would eventually overstep its bounds with regards to the rights of the individual citizens, and also another point that the federal government would overstep the rights of the states, the various states, because they didn't think the Constitution defined the power of the federal government enough. And some some Federalists agreed that a Bill of Rights is probably a good idea. Just to make sure that we know exactly which rights the people enjoy and are protected from the government. There were some Federalists who thought that, the federal government is never going to overstep its bounds and threaten the rights of its citizens. That's ridiculous. You're an idiot if you think that. Most notably, Alexander Hamilton. I'm sorry, the Anti-Federalists were proven absolutely 100% correct on this matter. The scary thing is that their Bill of Rights didn't go far enough in protecting the rights of the individual as well as the rights of the states. If it had gone far enough, we wouldn't have, a ton of court cases regarding the First Amendment or the Second Amendment or the Fourth Amendment or the Fifth, Sixth, Seventh. We don't hear a lot about the Eighth, though every now and then a death penalty case does come up with regards to cruel and unusual punishment. Every now and then the Ninth and 10th Amendments come up. The 14th is usually how people bring up the other amendments. Usually the Due Process or Equal Protection Clause. Actually, the Fifth Amendment has both of those as well. So typically it's either the 5th or the 14th that you'll try to use to argue that either a state or the federal government is violating one of your other rights, which is contained within within the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights does state that individual rights are not necessarily all the ones that we've listed out. But it happens. I mean, after all, Lincoln violated habeas corpus. Adams violated the First Amendment's protections of free speech. So did Woodrow Wilson. Sedition and Espionage Acts, anyone? Then you've got all the insane violations that have happened across our history. Lemon v. Kurtzman, Tinker v. Tinker v. Des Moines, just to name a few more cases that highlight violations of the government with regards to various different rights. Another complaint that the Anti-Federalists had was that they felt that the Constitution created a presidency so powerful that it would become a monarchy. While it hasn't become a monarchy, the role of the presidency has been greatly inflated over the past 200 years to the point where the formal way of addressing the president, Mr. President, may as well be a title of nobility. Or even just saying President so-and-so. It's kind of like people will say, oh, it's King James or King John or Queen Elizabeth. Yeah. President Trump, President Obama, President Biden. You notice how similar that sounds in our eyes? The president has a tremendous amount of power these days. Way more than he used to. And there are two presidents to blame for this. Andrew Jackson, who was actually part of Jefferson's Republicans and kind of sided with the Jeffersonian faction in a lot of ways because he was more agrarian and hated central banking. And yeah, it's kind of funny because Jefferson did everything he could to limit the power of the presidency, and Jackson was like, "No, I'm gonna do whatever I want." A good example. He never directly said this, but Jackson is sometimes misquoted or is saying after the Supreme Court effectively said, "No, you can't actually do the Indian Removal Act." Jackson is misquoted as saying, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Yeah. But that was Jackson's attitude. The second president who greatly expanded the power of the presidency is Theodore Roosevelt. Yep, good old Teddy. He used the presidency as a bully pulpit. Yeah, not exactly the ideal situation now, is it? They felt that the Constitution didn't address the judiciary enough and would lead to out-of-control courts. Were they wrong in this? Well, given how important the Supreme Court is in American politics these days, even if we don't want it to be political, they may have been right here, especially with how the court has, if you subscribe to the Anti-Federalist view, the court in Marbury v. Madison, it was actually not Marbury v. Madison, it was a case of a little bit before, where they had ruled in favor of a law that had been passed under the Commerce Clause, and they said it was constitutional. This law is in keeping with the Constitution. Marbury v. Madison, they ruled a law unconstitutional, and Anti-Federalists would say, see, they've taken power for themselves that they didn't have within the Constitution, and now this is going to lead to an out-of-control court. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. But you could also argue that it's an implied power of the court by the logic that the Constitution doesn't say that they can invalidate or uphold law in America based off of the Constitution. But what it doesn't say is that they can't do it. And actually, it's a logical consequence of having a Supreme Court, or a court system in general, where the court basically says, this is an unjust law. Yes, it's the law, but it's unjust, so we have to rule against it. In addition, the Supreme Court is also in a position where They have a constitution, and they look at, say, the Judiciary Act that gives them original jurisdiction over writs of mandamus, which was the issue at Hart and Marbury v. Madison. And the court says, wait a second, the Constitution says we have appellate jurisdiction here, and that, in changing our jurisdiction, isn't within Congress's powers in Article 1. We don't have jurisdiction over this. That section of the law is invalid. We can't hear this case is not within our jurisdiction. So it's kind of one of those things where it's like they kind of need it. And who is going to enforce the Constitution if not the courts? After all, it is the law, is it not? So while they may be correct, depending on who you talk to regarding activist courts and judicial activism, yeah, I think most people would say the courts have maybe taken a bit too much, depending on who you ask, and only in situations where the court disagrees with them, of course. You could argue that the Anti-Federalists were correct here. They believe the national government would be too far away, too centralized, and too far away from the people and their concerns, and thus not really interested in the needs of individual localities, municipalities, counties, etc. I mean, given how large the United States has become, maybe that's not necessarily something that's avoidable, no matter what system of government you have. But also, they're not necessarily wrong. It's hard to see them not being right. Especially if the federal government was way too involved in the lives of its citizens. I mean, then again, if I'd say point to me an issue the federal government hasn't regulated, and I'll show you the thing they'll regulate next. So, yeah, the federal government is irresponsive to the needs of individual localities, but also that was kind of inevitable anyway, with population growth, geographic growth, and time. I'm going to give them a half point for that one. And they believe that the Constitution would weaken or abrogate the power of the various states and allow the federal government to take more and more power for itself over the objections of the various states. And they are, of course, correct on that one as well, given that I'm going to use a very, very topical example. I'm not a fan of H.R. 1 because it seeks to involve the federal government in a domain that the U.S. Constitution declares is the domain of the state legislatures, and that is election law. Yeah, guess what? Only the individual state legislatures can determine election law. That's not even a joke. That's just flat out the truth. So, yeah, no, the Anti-Federalists were 100% right here. You only need one example. The federal government has no say in how states conduct its own elections. And yet, H.R. 1 seeks to do just that. So, let's talk about some notable Anti-Federalists so that you can, look at some of their so you can look them up and look at how actually different a lot of these people were. Patrick Henry was one of the most vocal Anti-Federalists. He also didn't write a ton. He was an orator. He was a speaker. His famous "Give me liberty or give me death." That's Patrick Henry. He was also very dramatic, I would argue. Samuel Adams, another rather fiery and dramatic character. Um, by the way, a lot of modern historians seem to think that the Anti-Federalists were naive, even simple in their mindset. But if you actually run down the list of their complaints with the Constitution, it's scary how hard they hit the nail on the head. It really is. They said we needed a Bill of Rights. Turns out that Bill of Rights not only was needed, but the one they got wasn't strong enough. They said the president would become way too powerful, and you've made him too powerful to begin with. The president has only gotten more and more and more and more and more powerful to where these days we hinge on every single word the president says. And you can go on and on and on with their complaints. Quite a few Anti-Federalists also complained about how the Constitution doesn't solve the issue of slavery. Yeah, gee, were they right about that one? Goodness gracious me, that they were so right about that one. Anyway, moving on. Like I said, Sam Adams, George Mason, one of the preeminent authors of the Bill of Rights. And when I say preeminent authors of the Bill of Rights, he basically authored the Second Amendment. There were tweaks to it, but if you want to see the one that is close to what he originally wrote, look at Virginia's version of the Second Amendment. If you want to talk about an explanation of what the militia means, there you go. The militia, comprised of the body of citizens. Yep, the militia and the people are one and the same. Richard Henry Lee, another Virginian. James Monroe, another Virginian. Yeah, Virginia had a lot of Anti-Federalists. John Hancock was another. And then one of the few politically active women, Mercy Otis Warren, and her husband, James Warren. If I remember correctly, it was her husband. Maybe slightly wrong about that. Maybe her brother-in-law or her son. Family connections are very difficult. George Clinton of New York. James Winthrop of Massachusetts. Luther Martin, who we're going to talk a little bit about soon, because he's one of the more interesting ones, to say the least. Like I said, because of his hatred of Thomas Jefferson, he became a Federalist, actually. He argued a pretty significant case against the Bank of the United States, despite being a Federalist who supposedly would have supported the Bank of the United States. That the Supreme Court, well, they ruled against his side of the argument because John Marshall was a very good Federalist. That was McCulloch v. Maryland. Luther Martin, well, the title in his book, in a book that I have, which is written out of history. It's by Senator Mike Lee of Utah. The chapter about Luther Martin in that book is Sober Lessons from Our Drunk Founding Father. And yeah, Luther Martin was prone to drink. Some describe him as a complete alcoholic. He was a notable orator, though some of his contemporaries said that He tires anyone who listens to him speak. He was one of the Constitutional Convention's most vocal opponents of maintaining slavery. He actually wanted the Constitution to abolish it, and he spoke loudly about it because it's Luther Martin. He was not going to not speak. He was a massive opponent of the Virginia Plan, especially having proportional representation in both chambers. He favored the small states in the discussions, and he eventually became so pissed at the fact that the Constitution was not doing it was shaping up to be a document, in his mind, wholly unworthy of support, that he and one of his fellow delegates from Maryland just stormed out of the convention. He never signed the document, and he argued against its ratification completely. But there were quite a few conventions. Everybody kind of speeds through the ratification conventions pretty quickly, and they don't really talk about how contentious and how tight it actually was. And the two most important states to get to ratify them were extremely close to not ratifying. And that's Massachusetts and Virginia. Massachusetts had a lot of Anti-Federalists. Sam Adams, the Warrens, James Winthrop, a few others, John Hancock, and they argued, at the very least, they were able to compromise and move forward with ratification, so long as they recommended a Bill of Rights, because ratification, the Constitutional Convention decided that conditional ratification would be void. Virginia and New York also did the same thing. And Virginia was the other one. Now, why were these two states so singularly important in the ratification process? Well, it's because the New England states, the other three New England states, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, those three states took their cues from Massachusetts. That's 4 states right there. And you needed 9 of 13 to ratify. So that puts you at just over ratification, by the way. Gets a little bit more worrisome. Now, those 4 states, the 3 other states, normally took their cues from Massachusetts. But Rhode Island, if I remember correctly, had already ratified. But I don't quite actually remember exactly. Trying to remember the order of ratification. Delaware, Georgia, New Jersey. And there were 2 states specifically where the Anti-Federalists prevailed for so long that the Constitution had already been ratified, and they were the last 2 holdouts. And that was because it was otherwise it wouldn't. They would be forced to adhere to it anyway, even if they didn't ratify. And those were North Carolina and Rhode Island. Both of those were the last states. So yeah, no, Rhode Island took it immediately. Delaware, Georgia, and New Jersey were the first 3 states to ratify, if I remember correctly. But yeah, for the most part, the southern states took their cues from Virginia. The New England states took their cues from Massachusetts. The mid-Atlantic states, generally understood to be Maryland, Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, they kind of did their own thing. Though Delaware was, in this era, very close to New England, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York were kind of swingy, and they could go either way. It's just kind of the way it was. Maryland was actually much closer politically to Virginia than it is nowadays, though they may be starting to align once again. But that's a story for way in the future, of course. I think I've rambled on for a bit long enough. The Federalists. Turns out they were right. If you like the content, likes, comments, subscriptions, they always do help. Important links are down in the description, and I greatly appreciate everyone who has helped this channel grow over the past few years and past few months even. Take it easy, everyone. Have a very lovely evening. Good night.